What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to take a look at Willie Jackson. His name was Oscar Tobin. Willie Jackson is often left out in conversations. A lot of people don't even know who Willie Jackson is. He's a phenomenal Jewish fighter. Now, I had a friend who was very good friends with Willie Jackson. As a matter of fact, they trained together in Stillman's gym back in the 20s. And Willie Jackson was some fighter. He would reside in the Bronx, New York. But he was originally from the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And he died November 12, 1961 in Brooklyn, New York. Now, Willie Jackson stood 5'6". He weighed 119.5 pounds. He would also fight at 136.25 pounds as well towards the end of his career. He had total fights of 144 fights, 83 wins, 41 losses, 15 draws. Monday, July 14th, 1913, he was in there with Johnny Young. Now, Johnny Young was from New York, and they fought in New York. It was a 4-round draw. It was the Olympic Boxing Club. As a matter of fact, it was Johnny Young's professional debut. Willie Jackson would find himself in the ring February 9th, 1914 with Willie Doyle. Now, I knew who Willie Doyle was. Studied him about 20 years ago. Very good club fighter was Willie Doyle. And they fought in New York's Madison Square Garden. 10-round victory for Willie Jackson. He was moving up. That was a step up for Willie Jackson. October 13th, 1914, he was in there with Jersey Frankie Burns. Fought him in New York. 10-round, no decision. 1915, he fought Red Cap Wilson. Now, let me tell you about Red Cap Wilson. He fought him twice, both in New York. And Red Cap Wilson was some fighter. Very hard puncher. He'd get in there with anyone. And that's how you have to measure fighters. He was calculating in his blows. And he was a very, very good boxer. See, back at that time, a lot of Jewish boxers, that's what they did. They were boxers. Knew how to move around in the ring. As did Benny Leonard and others. But Red Cap Wilson was some fighter. And Willie Jackson faced him January and March, twice. Both no decisions in 10 rounds. Willie Jackson next fought 6 fights in 1916. And he found himself in the ring with Johnny Kilbane. May 8th, 1916. And let me tell you about Johnny Kilbane. You're looking at him right here to your right. Johnny Kilbane was some fighter who turned out to be a champion, and he was in the ring with Benny Leonard. I consider Benny Leonard, along with Joe Gans, greatest lightweight champion of all times. Rocky Kansas, another lightweight champion. Eddie Wallace. I'm going to show you some of these fighters. Eddie O'Keefe, very good featherweight from Philadelphia. Johnny Dundee, the Scotch Wop. Now, Johnny Dundee, he fought from 1910 to 1932. He was born November 16th, 1893 to April 22nd, 1965. He stood 5'4.5" inches. He had a 63-inch reach, 321 total bouts, 113 wins. He was stopped 19 times himself. He had 31 losses and 18 draws. And Johnny Dundee was in a ring with Jimmy Goodwrench. He was a lightweight champion. Phil DeMonte, Eddie Wallace, George K.O. Cheney, Johnny Griffin, Freddie Welch, Tommy Dixon, Philadelphia Pal Moore, Patsy Cline, Eddie O'Keefe, Ghetto Kid, Kid Black, Sid Terrace, Red Chapman, Pal Morgan, Sid Berestein, Phil DeMonte, Jack Bernstein. You name them. And Johnny Dundee was in there with him. Remember when he faced Vince Pepper Martin? And I couldn't believe he faced Vince Pepper Martin. I heard a lot of stories about that fight. I did the research, and that was some fight. You see, at that time, the fighters on their block were like world champions to the world. They represented their neighborhood. And it was a big deal. At that time, you had Ruby Goldstein having fits with Sid Terrace. That was a big deal at that time in the Lower East Side. When Benny Leonard came into town, because he was originally from Manhattan, it was like the president came to visit that state. And that's how they looked at their fighters at that time. But Johnny Dundee was some fighter. He was called the Scotch Wop. He was an Italian fighter. And he knew how to play the ropes. He would sit on the middle strand. His neck would ride the top strand. And his feet would be planted up against the bottom strand. And he knew how to bounce and time and spin and move. He's a beautiful fighter was Johnny Dundee. I have him ranked number 9 collectively with Benny Leonard and Tony Canzaneri. All three ranked number 9, greatest fighters in history. That's my ranking system for those fighters. November 13th, Willie Jackson would knock out Tommy O'Keefe in his second round. Fought him in Philadelphia. Now that shocked everyone. And what was even more shocking, December 29th, it would be a no decision in 10 rounds. Leo Johnson in Madison Square Garden. And that was amazing because Leo Johnson was the AEF lightweight champion. He was also the colored lightweight champion. Very good fighter. He had 3 good fights with Leo Patterson, did Leo Johnson. 1917, 1-round knockout of the Scotch Wop, Johnny Dundee. And this happened in Philadelphia. June 29th, 10-round, no decision to Johnny Dundee in Madison Square Garden. You see, Willie Jackson faced Johnny Dundee 11 times. That's remarkable. He faced Lou Tender 3 times. Fought him twice in Philadelphia and once in Milwaukee. He had 3 fights with Rocky Kansas, who was a former lightweight champion. Fought him March 21st, 1921 in Madison Square Garden. Lost him in 12 rounds. Faced Freddie Welch, May 3rd, Summit, New Jersey. Lost him in 8 rounds. February 20th, 1922, Charlie White, Madison Square Garden, New York. I'm going to show you some of these opponents. November 5th, 1917, Patsy Cline, another underrated fighter. He came in with a fighting career record of 66-4-5. January 7th, 1921, Pinky Mitchell, who wound up becoming a junior welterweight champion. At that time, Pinky Mitchell had a fighting career record of 18-4-2. Fought him at Madison Square Garden. This is the mecca of boxing. November 16th, 1918, Eddie Wallace. He had a fighting career record coming into that fight at 32-38-9. Now, understand, these records, 32-38-9, it's not like the records today. It's different because the fighters that they fought, the rules, same-day weighing, everything was different then. And it wasn't so much pride of winning all the fights, it's how you fought. You would come off of a fight 3 days later and fight again. It's a different way of looking at their records back then. July 16, 1918, Benny Leonard, the Ghetto Wizard, 111, 17-7 was his fighting career record coming into that Willie Jackson fight. Fought him at the Madison Square Garden and lost. But Benny Leonard, as I stated before, I have him ranked along with Joe Gans as the greatest lightweight champion of all times. I want to show you some of the fighters that I just mentioned to you. Now, Johnny Dundee is to your right. He was a magnificent fighter. Very good boxing stance did Johnny Dundee have. Like I said, he fought from 1910 to 1932. A lot went on in 1910. A lot of great fights happened in 1910. I mean, I mentioned this before, but you had Jim Jeffries and Jack Johnson, Reno, Nevada. 4th of July, 15-round affair. Jim Jeffries came out of retirement off his alfalfa farm. He wanted to put Jack Johnson in his place. And they couldn't get anyone. They tried to get every single fighter and guys who were not fighters to defeat Jack Johnson. And they failed. So their last hope was Jim Jeffries. And Jim Jeffries was annihilated by Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson annihilated Jim Jeffries, I'll put it that way. Jim Corbett was in the corner of Jim Jeffries, urging him on, making slurs to Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson just beat him up, put him through misery for 15 rounds and took him out. He didn't want to let him go the whole 15 rounds. He wanted to make sure he knocked him out before that fight was over. 1910, Walter Dipley shot Stanley Ketchel. Stanley Ketchel was a 2-time middleweight champion. Had his wars with Billy Papke. He had a 6-round draw with Sam Langford. He was in the ring with Jack Johnson. Stanley Ketchel was one of the greatest middleweight champions of all times. Went to the body like nobody's business. So 1910 was some year. But Johnny Dundee, outstanding fighter he was. Another Willie Jackson opponent was Charlie White from Chicago. Fascinating lightweight. He was in the ring with Benny Leonard, among others. And Charlie White was a fascinating fighter. That's a great opponent for Willie Jackson. They fought February 20th, 1922. That would be the year that Nat Flasher would come out with the famous Ring magazine. I have that copy. I have every copy that Ring magazine came out with. USA and Australia, Mexico, have all of them. And Willie Jackson faced Charlie White in New York's Madison Square Garden. And that was like a pay-per-view fight for the fighters back then. Somewhat of a Mayweather and perhaps Canelo Alvarez, if you will. Because boxing was very big at that time. And Charlie White was from Chicago. You had a lot of great fighters come out of Chicago. You had Ever Hammer, who was a great lightweight. Barney Ross, fantastic welterweight and lightweight. Later on, you would have Johnny Bratton, want to become a welterweight champion of the world. So that was some fight with Willie Jackson and Pinky Mitchell. I meant to say Willie Jackson and Charlie White. But Willie Jackson fought Pinky Mitchell. I'm going to show you him as well. Here you have the Ghetto Wizard, Benny Leonard. Now, Willie Jackson was in a ring with Benny Leonard July 16th, 1918. Benny Leonard had a fighting career record coming into that fight at 111, 17, and 7. Fought him at the New York's Madison Square Garden. Now, Benny Leonard would defeat Willie Jackson. But we're talking about perhaps the greatest lightweight champion, along with Joe Gans of all times. And Benny Leonard was in a ring with everyone. Everyone. Outstanding fighter was the Ghetto Wizard, Benny Leonard. I have Benny Leonard ranked number 9, along with Johnny Dundee and Tony Canzaneri. Collectively, the 9th greatest fighter of all times. Brooklyn, New York's Eddie Wallace. Another phenomenal fighter. Willie Jackson was in there with. I'll tell you, Eddie Wallace was some fighter. I'll do a profile on him one day. And as you can see here, Eddie Wallace had the skin-tight gloves as well. I did a part 2 on the evolution of boxing gloves. But this is Eddie Wallace, fascinating fighter he was. I'll show you an opponent of Johnny Dundee. This is a fascinating fighter right here. I mean, amazing. His name, as you can see here, is Eddie Fitzsimmons. He faced Johnny Dundee. An outstanding fighter he was. Once again, Chicago's Charlie White. Dynamic fighter he was. You gotta study these guys. Can't go by the records all the time. You have to know about them. You have to have communicated with people who knew them. You gotta really study them deep in and out to understand them. I'm gonna show you another Johnny Dundee opponent. His name is Tommy Dixon.